Hello and welcome back to another episode of You Want to Do What with Dan and Julie. Today we've got George on, who is an architect. Hi, George.
Hello.
How are we?
I'm very good, thank you. Very nice to hear you both.
And you. So let's jump straight in, George. What do you do?
I am an architect and I specialise in designing traditional buildings. So sometimes they're classical buildings, but sometimes they're just traditional buildings. But I suppose in layman's terms, I design buildings in traditional styles. And I mainly do houses, but occasionally other kinds of building as well.
I found your profile on Instagram because I follow a few sort of things around design and architecture, and I love the style you design, like the classic. Do you call it neoclassical? Or is that wrong?
No, sometimes it is neoclassical. Yeah, neoclassical is, I suppose, one of the traditional styles of architecture. It's particularly common in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. But neoclassical is right.
I love that style. I just think there's so much attention to detail and thought, and the buildings are beautiful. You know, on your Instagram, you've got the Royal Crescent at Bath, and things like that. And it's just that architecture is beautiful. Why did you choose the style you did?
Well, my family background, I have a connection with classical architecture because my grandfather was an architect, and he practiced in from the 1930s to the 1970s, and at a time when most architects had rejected traditional architecture and were really doing modernism. And he continued to practice as a traditional architecture after the war, which was very uncommon. And so for me, it's, I suppose I'm following in a family tradition of sorts. So it's never really been that unusual for me, but it is unusual in the wider profession. And certainly people who are trained as architects now, it's quite difficult to get through 7 years of architectural training and still have a sort of an interest in traditional architecture intact, because a lot of the emphasis of training now is trying to discourage people from doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say, to become an architect, it is a very long education process. So
yeah.
Did you always, going through school, always desire to be an architect, and that was sort of always what you wanted to do? And how did you find the education of it?
So I suppose because there was architecture in my family, I thought that I ought to look at other things too, because it was sort of, sometimes the obvious thing is not the thing that you want to do. And so I never really had architecture at the forefront of my mind. And then sort of shortly before I left school and when I was thinking about universities, I realized that architecture was the thing that combined all of my interests, particularly drawing. From a very young age, I was always drawing, always doodling, always found it much easier to explain things through a drawing than through words. And so, to find a course that enabled me to draw, as well as still continuing academic interests, was perfect. So I suppose that I went to university thinking, I'm just going to enjoy doing the course. I didn't know whether I wanted to be an architect, but I just thought that the course looked really perfect. And because architecture is not taught in schools very much, certainly at my school, there wasn't really much awareness of what architecture consisted of. I think it's only really at university that you find out whether it's right for you or not.
And how was it for you leaving university and actually going into a practice? Did you find it quite a different change? And what was sort of like the jump between the two?
I think there's always a culture shock, isn't there, when you go from an academic environment into a sort of a working office. And the way that students work, we always used to get up at lunchtime and sort of work rather casually, and then most of the work was done in the middle of the night. Of course, you can't really do that in a professional environment. And I worked in an office, a traditional architecture office, in which everything was still done in a very old-fashioned way. All of the drawings were done by hand. Even letters were still typed on typewriters. There were no computers in the office at all. And this was in the mid-90s. So, by then, computers had sort of taken over word processing largely. So it was very unusual to find such an old-fashioned office. So, yeah, it was definitely a culture shock. But I think that's the case for most people coming out of university into a job. Is there's a big adjustment to be done.
So going to university for 7 years is obviously a lot of time to put into a subject, and I think it's still the case now that it's 7 years to become an architect. How was that kind of broken down over the 7 years on your course? What kind of things were you learning about?
So yeah, 7 years does sound like a long term, but in fact it's really 3 years to do the first degree. Then you go and work for an architect for a year. Then you come back to university and do a further 2 years of study, and that's the diploma. And then you go back to an architect's office and you do a further year. So it's really 5 years in university, but split into 2 chunks, and 2 years working for an architect. So it doesn't feel too bad. It's not 7 years all as a student, really. And I actually studied in Edinburgh, so there's a slightly different system there. Whereas rather than doing a 3-year degree and then a 2-year diploma, we actually did a 4-year degree, which was a master's degree, and then a 1-year diploma. So it's slightly different there. But I loved being at university, but I also loved working in an office. And definitely, once you've done your first year out working for an architect, when you come back to university, I think you treat the university experience very differently, because by then you're semi-professional. And I think that you have a different approach to work as a postgraduate student than you do as an undergraduate.
Slightly less partying, maybe?
Well, I was lucky to, in Edinburgh, we one of the great things about being a student in Edinburgh is the housing available to students is so good. And if you can find a very nice flat and manage to stay there for a couple of years, then you can have a really nice life quite cheaply. So I was really lucky with the flat that I had. It probably was more civilized than my undergraduate years. Yeah.
You said in your first placement out of university that you were quite in a very old school traditional style office. And over those years, architecture, design, and all that has moved on quite significantly. How have you sort of seen the progress of design through mediums like CAD and that develop over in your time as an architect? So
when I first went to an office, as I say, everything was drawn by hand on drawing boards, and we stood up at big A0 size drawing boards. And if we wanted drawings to be printed, then they were printed on a big, what was it called, a die line machine in a print room downstairs. And then all of the prints were folded up by hand and put into envelopes and sent off to consultants and clients. So there was no email, there was nothing digital in the office at all. So I would say that just when we set out to do a drawing, you would spend days on it and you would try and get as much information onto that drawing as possible, because at the end of it, it was being printed off and sent out to lots of people. So you really thought carefully about what you were doing. I would say that in contrast now, we're in such a different world. I mean, it's very difficult to compare it, the office environment now with how it was 30 years ago. Now, we sort of do so much you just do a quick sketch and then you send it out to people by email, and then you get sort of feedback back from it. And although all of the work that I do is drawn by hand still, all of the team that I work with in the office are, everything is CAD based. So it's, other than me, there's hardly any hand drawing at all. So yeah, it's totally different, or just unrecognizable. Anybody in my office who went back and looked at the office where I was when I first trained would just be astonished at how much has changed.
Do you think the development of sort of digital CAD and things like that has made some designers lazier?
I think that it's rather like in writing, that if you sit down to write an essay now, it's so easy to just write something quite quickly and think I can easily edit it later. Whereas in the days of typewriters, you really thought carefully about what you were writing, because to change anything was just that much more laborious. So I think there maybe is a bit of laziness, and people's minds are not so focused on getting it right first time. But at the same time, the technology's massively improved our ability to visualize things. So on a drawing board, what you're doing always is drawing things in 2D and relying on your mind to translate that into 3 dimensions. But with CAD now, we draw everything in 3D so that we can look at everything to a very high level of resolution, even as a sketch.
That's quite interesting, because I've worked with quite a few architects with what I do, and I find they're actually quite against designing in 3D, and they actually quite like their traditional just drawing plan views, elevations and sections, and they actually don't want to do too many 3D models.
Yes, I must say that mainly I draw in plan, section and elevation, and sometimes I will do a little perspective sketch of what something looks like. But I find it incredibly helpful to work with somebody in the office to do quick models. And actually, I think that architects have always built models, and the reliance on the drawing board is maybe more of a 20th century thing. But architects always used to commission models. Particularly for complex internal spaces, I think that nothing beats a model, really. So
absolutely.
I really think that our ability to build simple digital models of things and to I suppose really for complex spatial modeling, it's really so much better than 2D hand drawings.
I don't know if you saw it, George, but there's a program recently on BBC or on BBC Two, where a couple of architects would go into a house and design plans, and they'd use 3D visualization to show the clients what they designed in their own homes and be able to walk around it. And I thought that was amazing, because surely that, as an architect, when you're coming up with these plans, there's only so much you can show on a drawing, whereas actually being able to take your clients and put them into these scenarios must be incredibly helpful.
It is incredibly helpful, and I since you've asked me this, I sort of slightly hesitate to say this because I don't want it to come out the wrong way, but I think that sometimes the best thing that clients can do is to trust their architect, and being able to show them every last detail of what something is going to look like sounds like a good idea, but actually it's not always a good idea, because I find that the best jobs come when a client says, I'm not going to interfere with the process. They come and look at some other houses that I've designed and decide that they like them. And then they put their trust in you. And I do think that one of the difficulties with technology is that everything has become so possible and so available. Everybody thinks they're an expert. And I think that it's very important that expertise is retained amongst people who have a deep knowledge of things. And that that people learn to trust those experts. I really think it's important, and I hope that hasn't come across the right way, because it's going to, I wouldn't want in any way to stop a client from seeing what they were getting. But if you put a headset on and imagine yourself walking through a digital model, it is going to be nothing like being in a real building. I mean, honestly, nothing like, because the experience of being in a building is so complex, and it's all of our senses. It's sort of, we experience buildings based on the quality of the smells and touch and temperature and our mood and all sorts of things. It's so complicated.
It's a really good point, and I think actually in the show it sometimes shows the exact thing you're talking about, because sometimes the clients would go, "Oh, I don't really like that window there," or "Oh, I'd like to move that a bit and move this a bit," and you can tell at the end that although they're saying, "Oh yeah, no, it's great," you can tell that they're thinking, "Oh God, I wish I'd put that window in," and the architect's sort of standing there going, "Well, I told you so," kind of thing.
Yes. Exactly. I think trust is what is what's sometimes missing from these things, and some clients are better at it than others, I would say. Yeah.
So your style is obviously very classical, and you said that it comes from your grandfather and having this sort of relationship with it. But what was it about the classical style for you? Because at the beginning I said, modern architecture for me, I think lazy is the wrong word, but it's not as detailed. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but there's not as much. I feel like there's not much detail in the building. Sometimes they're quite brutal and quite sharp, whereas classical seems very ornate, and I just feel like that more goes into it. Maybe I could be completely wrong, but what was it for you that really sort of excites you about that type of architecture?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I don't want to sort of sound too preachy about it, because I love classical buildings, but I don't necessarily think that that all architects ought to do that. It's not to the exclusion of everything else. It's just what I'm interested in myself. But I have to say, I do find most modern architecture just quite bland and quite dull, and that combined with a sort of almost religious fervour with which modernist architecture is taught, I just always found a real turn-off, and I find the sort of thrill of walking into a really great classical building. I mean, you think of somewhere like St. Paul's or some of the great buildings in Rome, and there's a sort of a kind of visceral excitement that comes over you that I've just never had with modern architecture. And so that's what I try to capture in new buildings, is that the sort of it's craftsmanship, but it's design and it's meaning as well. I mean, the great thing about classical architecture, because people have been doing it for so long, is that it's very rich in allegory and illusion and meaning and all of those things as well. So I find it's a bit like a language that people have stopped using, and I look at it and think it's full of such richness. It's the pity that it's been rejected by so many people.
I always found architects to be, or construction to be, like this game of spinning plates, where you've got all these plates going, and the architect saw the person at the bottom bringing all those plates together and keeping them going.
Yes.
You've got your MEP guys, your structural engineers, your site guys. Everyone sort of comes back to the architect, and they sort of oversee it. How is it to be that sort of go-to person in that project where you've got all these different plates you've got to keep spinning and keep up there and appease them all?
Yes, it's when I was first training, I remember my first boss described to me that the architect's job is a bit like steering a ship through very choppy waters, and everybody is trying to blow you off course. You've got the services consultant who wants to do one thing, and then you've got the structural engineer who wants to do another, and the client may be trying to pull the project in another direction. And your job is to try and steer a sort of a straight course while everybody is trying to move you in different directions. And I think it's a good way of thinking about it, because you just need to keep a clear head. And but all the time you have to be aware that that things can go wrong. So I find a lot of my job is just sort of is trying to spot problems before they occur and keep a straight course.
So that sort of leads us nicely into, what do you actually do every day? You know, you obviously meet with clients and design, but how does that work for you on a daily basis?
Yeah, it is incredibly varied. I mean, just at the moment, because we're in lockdown, I'm not traveling as much as I otherwise would. But I would say that, like everybody, every day there are lots of phone calls and meetings and emails. So that's maybe not that interesting because everybody does that. But I also, some days I'm going to see a new client, and that will involve going to see a site and talking to them about what they want to do. And often that can be quite a wide-ranging conversation to find out what they like, what kind of houses they've been brought up in, what kind of architecture they like, how they live. And the great thing about designing houses for people is you have to really understand what's in their minds and how they live from day to day. And everybody thinks that they're a normal family, but everybody has a different version of normality. So there's no such thing as normal. And so it's discovering what each person's normality is. So that's really fascinating. And then often I'll be at building sites. So today I've been at a building site all day, just keeping track of progress of a construction project, which is going to be on site for the next couple of years. And so it's going around inspecting all of the work and looking at new projects that are coming forward on that site. So that's really interesting. And then some days, tomorrow I'm going to be at the drawing board all day, just doing drawings. The sort of the job that I thought I was going to be getting into when I was 18, when I first went to university, I still do that job. I just sit down with a big pad of paper and lots of pencils, and I just draw. And it's lovely to have those days. So yeah, it could be lots of different things on any given day.
You sort of mentioned it slightly in that answer as well. How much of the design process for you when you go and meet clients is about how they actually live and how they use the spaces?
It is a lot about that, but there are certain things that all projects have in common. I mean, the brief for most houses is quite similar. Everybody wants a certain number of bedrooms. The downstairs, everybody wants living to be based around the kitchen. But then off the kitchen, you want areas where people can be more quiet or more private. And there are some parts of the house which are sort of hard surfaces for eating and cooking, and then there are softer parts of the house as well. So yeah, every project is different, but there are common strands that run between all of them. And so when you sit down with a client, you are always thinking about their specific needs, but also about sort of common threads with things that you've done before that would work well for them too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. What would be some personality traits that you see in yourself and some of the other architects around you that you think really help them thrive and make them successful?
So, the reason I became an architect really is that I am very interested in buildings, and I love all the different parts of buildings. The sort of, I suppose that's a kind of engineering side of my of my head, which is to do with how things are put together and the kind of nuts and bolts. But increasingly, I've realised that you've got to be interested in people as well. You can't just be interested in the kind of building fabric, because architecture is as much about people as it is about buildings. So having a sort of empathy for people and taking an interest in their lives and how they're going to live is really important too. I think you've got to be quite diplomatic, because you often find yourself, especially with private clients, sometimes trying to negotiate the needs of different people. Typically a husband and wife might not always have exactly the same outlook on things, and so trying to kind of find a way through that. And then they may have friends, or their children may have a view on things. So you've definitely got to be a natural diplomat. And I think you've got to also know when to be firm. You can't be a complete pushover. And some of the things that we do in architecture, I think particularly of the planning process, you've got to have a lot of conviction in what you're doing, and sometimes have the ability to persuade people that you're doing the right thing.
And what for you would be some of the biggest, maybe the two biggest positives of working within this field?
Speaking for myself, I've got in many ways the perfect job. It's so varied, and when I talk to other people about what they do, what lawyers do, or what accountants do, or what people who run charities, or just any job you can think of, I feel like at some point or other I've got that hat on, because there are so many different aspects to architectural work, and planning and contracts are highly legal, so you really need to understand those. The construction process is like engineering, and you have to understand how things are put together. But design is very artistic, and so at times you feel like you're a fine artist. So there's a bit of lots of different things. Sometimes I feel like a psychologist, sitting in client meetings trying to understand what people want. So yeah, I really think it's incredibly varied. And I enjoy all aspects of the job, not just the drawing part. It's really the huge variety that appeals most to me.
I think architects are actually really interesting, and you sort of made the point there that very rarely do you find someone with the ability to be very creative, but then obviously very granular in the detail and knowing how to actually create the thing that they're drawing.
Yes. Yeah. You've got to know an awful lot in order to do the job properly. And that's probably one thing that makes architecture slightly off-putting to people, is that as you approach architecture, the range of skills that you need to do it and the amount of knowledge to do it properly. At times I remember when I was first joining an office and looking at what people were doing, it just seemed overwhelming. And I remember somebody saying to me that you can only be a good architect once you're middle-aged, because there's just so much to learn. But it's a very enjoyable process.
And on the flip side of all this, what would be some of the negatives that you find with this industry?
What are negatives? I feel I've been really lucky in having amazing opportunities and working on nice projects. And at the moment, I've got lots of lovely things, really, really interesting projects we're doing. Some of them are working on old buildings, and some of them are building new ones. There are definite frustrations with the planning system. I do think that when, of all of the things that we deal with, planning is the most frustrating. It's a very cumbersome process, and somehow does need to be reformed, I think. And
I'd certainly agree with that. I know I've worked on a couple of projects where there's like something that's said in the planning stage. You get right to the end, and you're like, "Yeah, why did we say that in the planning stage? It doesn't. It just doesn't work now."
Yeah. I'm, of course, I'm talking about the sort of statutory, like getting planning permissions for things, listed building consents, all of that, and that process, which is heavily regulated. Is very unreliable, I would say. And, there are sort of defined timescales to make applications and get decisions, and they very, very rarely are met. So, I would say planning is a huge frustration, but obviously it's necessary. Is that a negative? I think it's just something that you live with. Maybe, what else might be negative? I think that, I used to think that at university that it was a pity that classical architecture or traditional architecture got such a hard time at universities, and I think that there's a huge amount of reform that needs to happen in the education system to just be more broad-minded, because I feel that universities are still stuck in the 1970s in many ways, and they're only able to teach one thing, and they believe in the sort of moral purpose of that one thing. But actually, we live in a much more sort of pluralistic time now, and I think that students have much more knowledge and availability to information, and I think that universities haven't really caught up with that. So I don't know if that's a negative, but it was definitely a frustration when I was a student.
So we like to talk a little bit about what people can expect to earn from the industry. And we just go away and we look at some rough figures. And apparently a newly qualified architect, tell us if you sort of agree with these figures roughly, could look at maybe a £30,000 starting salary. Someone with 5 years experience possibly earn up to 45,000 maybe. And then after that, it's very much up to you if you become a director or you start your own practice. There's a lot of opportunity once you're in the industry.
Yes, that sounds, those figures sound about right to me. It is what you make of it. When I was training, people always used to say that architects weren't particularly well paid. And I don't have much to compare it with because I've only ever been in the architectural industry, but it's a very enjoyable job. I would say it's not as well paid as some jobs, but then job satisfaction is something that is
unmeasurable.
Yeah, unmeasurable. That's a good word. Yeah.
What would be something that you come across every now and then, maybe within this industry or your job, that you just never expected whilst going into architecture?
I don't think that I ever realised how varied the job would be. I thought that it would just be designing buildings, and as I say, the more human side of it, I didn't really realise. And it's quite a difficult thing to train people to do, those sort of very human skills of just being able to explain things to people carefully in a gently persuasive way. Is a skill you've either got or you haven't. And it's particularly important when doing private work for houses, that sort of thing, because building up a good rapport with the client is very important. And what else did I not know? I had no idea, of course, that of the changes in technology, but it is positive in some ways, but I think that we generate far too much disposable stuff now. Most emails might as well never have been written.
Yeah.
And we all spend our lives tied to answering emails. just it's interesting. My grandfather did in the late 1960s built a large new country house, and a similar sort of project to the ones that I do now. And because I trained when I left university, I trained in his office, so all of the paperwork from that project was still there, and the entire correspondence for that house. So all the client correspondence, all of the consultants, all of the planning, everything fitted into one A4 box file. Whereas now, the amount of paperwork generated for one project, I mean, it would be several rooms full of just pieces of paper with pointless emails printed on them. And of course, we don't print out emails, but it's just, the ability we now have to communicate is great, but sometimes there's over communication, I would say.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with that. So from your point of view, how does somebody begin to progress within the industry and build themselves a reputation?
I think that it all really, I suppose, comes down to finding the right office to join when the time comes, and finding an office that is doing the kind of work that you're interested in, and which there are opportunities for your career to grow. And it's one thing we're very conscious of in our office is to try and sort of keep talking to people about their career map, and making sure that they are setting goals, and we're helping them achieve those goals. But some offices are better at that than others. But I think being in an office that's doing the kind of work that you're interested in, that's the key to it. And then just building as much experience as possible. I always found that, sometimes the things you learn about are just having your ears and eyes open to what is happening in your peripheral vision. So it's not necessarily what's right in front of you. It's just keeping, just listening out for what is going on around you. And you learn so much that way.
And would you still go into this industry knowing everything you know now?
Yes, I can't think for a moment what else I would do. Yes, I love it, and every day I sort of, it never comes to Friday, and I think, oh, thank goodness it's Friday, and I've got the weekend. It would never occur to me. I'm doing a job I love, and I never ever take that for granted.
That's all you can ask for, right?
Yeah. And I suppose, just to finish, quite a lot of what I do, I would do even if somebody wasn't paying me to do it. And that's the sort of test, really.
Yeah.
Are you doing the right job?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, George. I've really, really enjoyed the chat. It's been really fascinating.
Good. Oh, it's a pleasure. Very nice to hear you, and thank you for asking me to do this. And I hope it'll be of interest to other people.
And thank you so much, George. Where can people find your Instagram and anything else about you?
Oh, yes. So I'm George Somers Smith. My surname is a bit complicated, but if anybody looks me up on Instagram, my surname is Saumarez, and then Smith. And I'm pretty easy to find on Instagram. I've got quite a few videos on YouTube of me doing drawings of classical detail, and speeded up drawings, drawings which have been done over the course of a day, but they're speeded up so you can watch them in 5 minutes. And various lectures I've given about classical architecture, if anybody is interested in that. So, but Instagram, I find, is a great way of connecting with people, because I use it as a kind of visual diary, and you can be very personal with Instagram and connect with a wide audience, which, is, I think, an amazing thing about it. It's so different from corporate connections. It's very, feels much more one-to-one.
We will make sure to link you on our social media when it comes out as well.
Great. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that, George.
Pleasure.